So, today's video is going to be a little spicy, I think. Finally found enough time to get away from dispatch to actually make one of these more casual videos. I made a Google Doc submission box for members of patrons in the Astartes Anonymous Discord to anonymously or publicly submit their Warhammer 40k hot takes for me to rank. And I'm gonna be honest, I got way less submissions than I would have hoped for. However, the upshot of that means this video is going to be super manageable to make. So a few things first, I'm going to put each of these into one of 4 different rankings based on cold to spicy. So cold, lukewarm, hot, and spicy. There might be some crossover, and of course this is all ultimately subjective, not just the takes, but my responses to them. However, I'll do my best to be sincere. Oh yeah, and by the way, there was like 2 entries I removed. Not because they were overtly spicy or anything, but because those submissions were literally huge walls of text. One of them was multiple paragraphs. I didn't think to put a word limit on the submission, so that's on me. Right, let's look at our first one. 5 Norn Queens in a Trench Coat says, "The Black Templars are overrated. They're not as cool as everyone says they are." Right, okay. Wild first take, not gonna lie. 5 Norn Queens hasn't provided any further explanation for this take, but I really do think we can call this a spicy take right off the bat. The Black Templars are and have always been synonymous with the greatest elements of Warhammer 40k ever since their inception. Their 3rd edition artworks by John Blanche are in all likelihood the origin point of the phrase grimdark. In fact, I'm really sorry 5 Norn Queens in a Trench Coat, I think this is a crazy take. You know, even if we restricted our assessment of the Black Templars to just Hell's Reach and nothing else, we're still treated to the greatest ingredients of 40k in a microcosm. Indomitable human resilience in the face of suffering, madness, and overwhelming odds. The cracked bridge that stands between Space Marines and mortal human understanding. The relationship of Grimaldus and Andre that successfully crosses that bridge. I mean, even looking at just the model side of things, the Black Templars have hosted some of the greatest Space Marine models in every single era of 40k. I know guys who despise the Primaris era in the very core of their being, who still adore this generation of Black Templar models. So yeah, super spicy take there. Black Templars are lauded by the masses for a reason. Remind me to chase you in the Discord when you see this 5 Norn Queens in a Trench Coat. I'd really love to hear your reasoning for this. Okay, next up we have Lord Mick, who says, "Lorgar is the cause of the Horus heresy and everything, not Erebus." I'm gonna be real, Mick, this is a super cold take. Like, I remember speaking to Moots about this, the artist for the Astartes Anonymous channel, Discord, and everything else, and we played around with the idea that you could argue it's a hot take because it's so incorrect, but then we realized a hot take isn't just a take that's incorrect, it has to be controversial. And this isn't controversial, it's just incorrect. In as much as it implies that Erebus is A, totally innocent of his role in the heresy, and B, that Lorgar and Erebus can't both be guilty of their roles in the heresy at the same time. Not to mention, this kinda ignores others who fell to chaos super early, like Callus Typhon, aka Typhus, who was preparing to turn his brothers and father to chaos entirely separate of the Wordbearer's chicanery. So yeah, super cold take, not gonna lie. Okay, this next one is by far the longest take we had. If this was any longer, I think I would have cut it, so I'll read it here entirely verbatim. Swidblad says, "The theory that the Tyranid Hive/Tyrant Guard were made using Space Marine DNA because of their fused ribcage makes no sense at all. Are you telling me that the species that has consumed at least one galaxy never stumbled upon a creature with a fused ribcage until they met a Space Marine? It makes Tyranids feel so small-scaled instead of this extragalactic threat they're supposed to be when they find very obvious things they should already have." That was a mouthful. I remember sitting down with Moots and talking about this one, and both of us agreeing immediately that it was a lukewarm take. Here's the thing, this take pivots on the idea that the Tyranids have consumed another galaxy, and therefore reaped the benefits of doing so is something that's confirmed, when it's not. Of course, it makes sense, but that's not the same as it being true, let alone provably true. However, I do still think there's some credence to this take, in as much as it knocks on the door of a much bigger problem with the Tyranids, in that the Tyranids are very often depicted in both novels, indexes, and codices as being these perfect creatures, these perfect life forms, when they are in fact not very perfect at all. I could start rambling about the Swarm Lord here, but I'm not going to. I can't help but think about the wider issues with the depiction of the Tyranids as a faction, without also thinking about the Flood from Halo and the Zerg from StarCraft. Now this really will get the comments going, I'm sure, because the Flood from Halo is, to oversimplify, a great sentient mutant virus species, whereas the Tyranids are an all-consuming, perfectly adaptive hive mind. And the Zerg are kind of somewhere in between the two, but leaning a little closer to the Tyranids. This is all a gross oversimplification, by the way. A lot of the weaknesses in the Zerg and the Flood make sense in their own canons, and the sheer terror of them as galaxy-ending threats feels much more consistent than the Tyranids, I think, because the Tyranids are very generalized in their depictions. I think it's one of those occasions where written lore, being half lore, half propaganda, doesn't really work for the Tyranids' benefits. This doesn't mean to say that the Zerg or Flood are perfect narrative tools, I just find their depictions to be a lot more consistent. Anyways, yeah, lukewarm take. Right, next. Zeta says, Zeta says, the Grey Knights either need to be completely rewritten from the ground up, or retired full stop. Damn, the industrial writings of Matt Ward and its consequences strikes again. I'm gonna try and not devolve into a breakdown of all the things wrong with the Grey Knights here, but I totally know what you mean. However, I do still think this qualifies as a hot take. The idea of retconning the entire faction from the ground up is wild. Games Workshop couldn't implement a retcon respectfully if the lives of every other Warhammer fan was at stake. It's funny, I almost put this down as a cold take for a joke, just because I wouldn't really be surprised at all if Games Workshop did/do discontinue the Grey Knights altogether and bring about their narrative destruction. I went over this in the recent Grey Knight video we did, because even with Matt Ward out of the way, Games Workshop has usurped the role of the Grey Knights in the grand narrative repeatedly. Anyways, yeah, hot take, and shameless plug of our last Grey Knight video for those who want to understand the meta-contextual destruction of the Grey Knights. Right, next up, our first anonymous submission. Corvus Corax was the only Primarch smart enough to be involved as little as possible with the Imperium. Cold take. Remind me to put a picture up right here, right now, of Jagatai Khan saying, "Am I a joke to you?" Now, we've got another from Swidblad. Another long one, and holy I remember getting really worked up talking to Moots about this take. I didn't realize I'd get triggered so easily by someone dogging on Imperial spaceship designs. Swidblad says, almost all of the Imperium's ships look the same, and it is almost impossible to tell them apart. There is almost no creativity in their design, and the silhouette of them is too similar. I understand that they wanted them to have a unique design language, but compared to any other setting, they just end up looking like upscaled copies of each other. Damn, man. I was gonna put this as a cold take, but you get lukewarm for eliciting such a wretched emotion out of me. Man, please look at Battlefleet Gothic. There is so much variation with Imperial vessels, from the grand cruisers to the fighters. Yes, they're all heavily influenced by real-world historical vessels from various eras, but damn, son, this take is just mean. Yeah, I was gonna go cold, but you really got me up with this, so yeah, promote it to lukewarm. Alright, this next one is real spicy. Submitted anonymously, this person said, I feel like 40k would be better without the Space Marines. Yeah, spicy take. I barely know where to begin with this. For starters, there would be about 80% less 40k without the Space Marines. It's hard because you can tackle this from a lore standpoint or a meta standpoint, so I'm going to try and do both. Speaking from a meta perspective, whilst most things in 40k suffer from being overshadowed by the Space Marines, the sheer overwhelming popularity of the Astartes is why 40k has survived as a continual setting for 4 decades. I'm open to being wrong, but I'm wholly unconvinced that 40k would have gotten far past Rogue Trader in 1987 if it wasn't for the Space Marines. So when you say 40k would be better without the Space Marines, I don't think I'm alone in thinking that if it wasn't for the Space Marines, there may just not have ever been a 40k. Now, from a lore standpoint, you could be saying the setting would be more interesting without the Astartes, or just if the Astartes were less prominent. And if the latter, I think a lot of people would agree with you. The setting may well be more interesting if the lion's share of attention wasn't with the Space Marines, but instead spread pretty evenly amongst everyone. But that's not what we're discussing. We're talking about no Space Marines at all. It's a fun one. We did a podcast a little while ago where we went over the idea of what 40k would look like if another faction were the poster boys. And I think a lot of those talking points are really relevant here. I'd be willing to bet that the happiest of all 40k fans would be the Imperial Guard guys, because we'd undoubtedly see them take up the more prominent space as the embodiment of human resilience. I mean, hell, there's lots of Imperial Guard novels that already exist where this is just outright the case, and I can't see anyone complaining about having more of that. But ultimately, Space Marines comprise most of 40k's sales for a reason. People love them. Space Marines in Warhammer 40k have always provided a really unique flavor of superhuman warrior that most settings can barely grasp. And even though I think that recipe of hyper-gothic transhuman warrior monks has been watered down with Primaris, it's still true to say that Space Marines are infinitely popular for a myriad of reasons. So yeah, spicy take. Definitely a lot of discussion to be had with that one. Good job. Okay, so this next take did have a name attached to it, but I'm gonna executively take the name away and swap it to anonymous because I don't think this take is worded very thoughtfully, to be honest. They have said, the theory that Tyranids are running away from something is completely moronic. That's a lukewarm take, I think. I would say that the idea of the Tyranids running away from something, or someone, is without precedent is a cold take, but maybe applying moronic as a descriptor takes it up to being a lukewarm take? No one's going to disagree that there's no precedent for this theory, because ultimately there is no precedent for it. But I don't think it's moronic. I certainly wouldn't feel the need to insult someone's theory just for theory crafting. No one's running around pretending it's true, you know? I don't think we need to be cruel to each other just because some people really like the Tyranids. Next up we have Zida again, who says, out of universe, Legiones Imperialis should not have been stealing every other Horus Heresy Thursday post on WarCom. This might be a super cold take, because it's as close as damn it an opinion can get to being objectively true while still being an opinion. Like, don't get me wrong, I really like Legions Imperialis, but when you see a Thursday WarCom update, and it's just the same as the prior Thursday, but downscaled for epic scale, it's like, huh? No one's asking for this. And I think what really makes this a problem is perhaps a level of deception on Games Workshop's part. Because if you say it's technically true that Imperialis is Horus Heresy, therefore belongs on the Heresy WarCom Thursdays, you have to say it's technically true. Games Workshop is well aware that prior to Imperialis, the community understanding and expectation was that Thursdays would be used to promote, tease, and show off the new Horus Heresy 2nd and then 3rd edition content. They really should have communicated that it was going to be used for Imperialis much sooner. Reveal schedules be damned, consistent transparency with your community is far more important than the release of a single, sadly underperforming game system. So yeah, cold take, but also I couldn't agree more. Oh boy, this next one's going to irk a few people. So, Compulsive Kitbash says, Gravis armor is hot garbage. What is the point of Gravis when compared to Terminator Plate? Phobos is a much better secondary variant since it makes sense to want a less armored but faster and more agile squad of Marines. Damn, man. Yeah. I think Moots and I agreed that this is a hot take. Especially calling Gravis hot garbage. Like, out of all the new Primaris armor variants, purely from an aesthetic point of view, I'm confident that Gravis has been the most well received, but let's say I'm wrong. Let's say it's the opposite, right? Let's say that, like, no one likes how Gravis looks, and then let's instead look at the only things that do matter. Does it fill a niche in lore? And does it fill a niche on the tabletop? Well, in lore, Gravis is a heavy armor variant that can fly, infiltrate, and is considerably cheaper / easier to produce than Terminator armor. So its function and origins are different. It's not just heavy armor, it feels a different role in both terms of what it does on the battlefield and the kind of resources the Imperium needs to expend to make it. Terminator armor gets to retain its mastery of teleportation, its unique role in boarding actions with Space Hulks and whatever else, whilst Gravis becomes more of a nuanced, cheaper frontline option. And curiously, this is also all reflected on the tabletop. Yeah, definitely a hot take. I think this kind of mirrors some of the thoughts echoed about the introduction of Gravis 8 years ago, when we felt the shift to Primaris. Worrying about the place of Terminator armor was very commonplace at the time, but I think Games Workshop has done at least a serviceable job in differentiating the two, so yeah, definitely a hot take. Goodnight Questoris says, the return of the Primarchs is actually a good thing for the setting, and we should get more Primarchs in the future, but changed in the same way as the Lion and Guilliman. Yeah, this is a lukewarm take. I'm not sure I wholly agree, but I don't wholly disagree either. There's some really convincing arguments I've heard over the last few years for why the Primarchs should stay gone. But I think in the 40k zeitgeist, the idea of the Primarchs returning, kneecapping the setting has been settled a lot since, 2016, 2017. I think now, generally speaking, it's a lot more accepted. I don't really see many people arguing this point with the same degree of vitriol and controversy that it once had. I think ultimately I'm not the biggest fan of how humanized the Primarchs have become. I really liked that period of time when they were just these unknowable beings of myth, but I really enjoyed reading Lion, Son of the Forest, and there's at least 20 or 30 Primarch moments from the Horus Heresy that give me chills. And I think this way of looking at things isn't super uncommon. Of course, we all still know one or two people who die hard about the Primarchs staying as these impossible things, but I think the vitriol surrounding this idea is pretty much gone. But yeah, defo's still lukewarm. Most communities still have someone who will pop up to remind you of how cool it was when Primarchs were unknowable. This next one is definitely a hot one. So, anonymously submitted, someone has said, if you hate on the Ultramarines, you probably just don't like or don't understand Space Marines. Oh, that's a fun one. I remember having a conversation with a peer of mine about this exact topic. I think it's really interesting. The Ultramarines get dogged on a lot for things synonymous with plot armor and Mary Sueisms, but there's a lot of Ultramarine content, and those things, these Mary Sueisms and such, are largely, but not always, restricted to the minority of novels and index entries. Because when you put those few Matt Ward-esque moments to one side, what you're left with, in my opinion, and you're welcome to disagree with me, is ostensibly the quintessential Space Marines. Almost every Space Marine chapter has dumb, outrageous moments. Don't get me started on the Dark Angels, Blood Angels, or the Space Wolves. Sure, the Ultramarines might have a monopoly on it, but they're also the single most core subfaction in the entire setting. They are our lens to 40k most of the time. And here's the fun bit. The hot take isn't that you should like the Ultramarines. You don't need to venerate the Ultramarines, you don't need to love the Ultramarines, they don't need to be your favorite faction. But instead the take is that dogging on the Ultramarines is symptomatic of people perhaps misunderstanding what it is that makes Space Marines in general so special. It's an interesting take. I'm sure this one will drum up some conversation. Do I agree with it? Yeah, mostly. I think I've read enough Ultramarine-centric books to say that you can hate on Matt Ward and Mary Sue moments while still acknowledging how important Ultramarines are to the core identity of the Adeptus Astartes as a faction. Yeah, hot take, very cool. I'm sure there'll be some discussion on this one. Right, next up, Balthazar Gelton, a Gyrocopter, says, the Tyranids need more devastating winds to be taken seriously as a bigger threat. Damn, man, you think the Tyranids aren't a massive threat? I think this is a bit of a lukewarm take, just because the Tyranids are undeniably a colossal threat to not just the Imperium, but every bastard unlucky enough to come across them. I think what we've got here is an example of perhaps wanting / expecting core factions to suffer horribly at the hands of the Tyranids. But, even then, it's a bit hard to support wholly. Like, reading The Devastation of Baal for the second time, at no point do you ever feel like the Tyranids are anything less than galactic horrors, set about the total annihilation of any and everything, with the power to back it too. There are almost certainly a dozen plus chapters, maybe even more, and uncountable worlds entirely destroyed by the Tyranids. I think this is really symptomatic of wanting to see more coremost factions suffer at the hands of the Tyranids, but it's a difficult one for me. Maybe it might be a hot take instead of a lukewarm take. I'm not wholly sure now that I'm thinking about it, because on one hand, I want to say that we've seen frighteningly little destruction from the Fourth Tyrannic War, but we also know that it's been so bad that the Imperium has exterminated an entire ring of loyal human-inhabited planets spanning uncountable sectors just to slow the Tyranids down, likely resulting in the deaths of trillions of human beings, entirely self-inflicted. Yeah, I think it's a lukewarm take. I think you just need to grab some more Tyranid-centric novels and indexes and such. They dump truck almost everything they come into contact with. Oh, and finally, we're going to end on a spicy take. Anonymously submitted, this user has said, Space Marine 2 isn't even good. Space Marine 1 was better. Where do I begin with this? Yeah, that's a spicy take. Space Marine 2 has already multiplicatively outpaced Space Marine 1 in every possible criterion. I think saying Space Marine 2 isn't even good is a hot take. I don't think that alone constitutes it being a spicy take, because Space Marine 2, despite the great reception, is a pretty flawed game. Like, here's the thing, I'm pushing 30, and I'm gonna be honest, I hail from an era where when you bought a game, you didn't have to wait like 12 months for the generic survival mode to be a part of that game. I'm gonna be real, the guys running the Astartes mod, and those managing the extended Space Marine 2 multiplayer stuff on Nexus, those guys, to me, are just as important to the survival of Space Marine 2 long-term as Saber Interactive. Here's the thing, the take doesn't just posit that Space Marine 2 is flawed, it posits that Space Marine 1 is better, which is wild. Don't get me wrong, Space Marine 1 had some exceptional quality. The power trip you get in the first half of Space Marine 1's campaign outperforms the same power trip in Space Marine 2, in my opinion. I think Space Marine 1 has better sound design as Space Marine 2, and I think the fact that Mark Strong himself is attached to it was huge. But ultimately, Space Marine 1, for the vast majority of people, became super forgettable, super fast. Third-person action shooter competing with Gears of War at Gears' cultural and community height? Madness, impossible. And still to this day, 99% of people would rather play Gears of War 2 or 3 than Space Marine 1. Yeah, this is a wild take. I'm all for Space Marine 2 criticism. The game is not perfect, but in almost all criteria, I believe Space Marine 1 is the inferior game. Not a bad game, just not as good. Right, that's it for this one. If this video performs well and doesn't kick up a metric ton of dirt at my face, I may consider doing another. Fingers crossed that giving the patrons a bit of spotlight on the channel may indeed prompt a few other people to join the Astartes Anonymous Patron. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.